Hey guys, it's John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another Let's Learn video on Christmas Carol characters. So we're going to give you a really nice who's who, kind of a nice overview of all the key characters. Then for the high grades, we're going to pick apart what we call the allegorical symbolism of the characters. So that's basically what the characters truly represent, the deeper meanings behind each one. So that should help unlock the high grades. And then we will look at a character arc. So we'll look at kind of Scrooge specifically and how he kind of evolves throughout the narrative in a moral kind of and social sense. Okay then, so let's dive into the who's who. So firstly then, we have Ebenezer Scrooge, the kind of star of the show in some ways. So he's very much a cold-hearted, miserly businessman. He would not give you a penny for anything, and he rejects compassion and charity. However, as we know, the novel centres around his moral growth, and he does change. He does actually become a better person by the end of the narrative, which we'll dive into in a little bit later. Then we have Jacob Marley. So that is Scrooge's deceased business partner, and he's doomed now to wear heavy chains as punishment for his greed. So in life, Jacob Marley was an extremely greedy character like Scrooge, and he didn't have time. He died before he had time to change, so he's condemned now to kind of live with those heavy chains all around him. Okay. Then we have the first of the ghosts. So we have the ghost of Christmas past. So a kind of mysterious glowing spirit who shows Scrooge his own childhood and his early life, because obviously we're all defined by our upbringing up to a degree, and the ghost of Christmas past kind of reminds Scrooge of his past and how that has kind of shaped his actions in the present day. Then we have the ghost of Christmas present. So they're a very jolly, kind of generous spirit who reveals the joy and the hardship of Christmas across society. So kind of almost begging the reason why Scrooge isn't helping in that sense, and kind of help to make Christmas a much more pleasant time of year. Then we have the ghost of Christmas yet to come. So a much more ominous, brooding figure who shows Scrooge the future consequences of his actions. Time is running out for Scrooge because he's getting older, and when he dies, that's it. There's no more chance to change. So the ghost of Christmas yet to come is kind of reminding Scrooge of his own mortality and the need to change quickly. Then we have Bob Cratchit. So Bob Cratchit, as he looks in the image, he looks quite beaten down. He's Scrooge's underpaid but still kind-hearted clerk, and he's devoted to his family. So he really represents the kind of the best of the Victorian working class in that sense. Okay, then we have this delightful figure, looking very cheery there, Tiny Tim. So Tiny Tim is Bob Cratchit's disabled son, but he's still very optimistic about life. He's full of kindness, full of charity, and full of hope. So really kind of a great character in that sense. And he's almost a foil against Scrooge's miserliness in that sense. Okay, and then we have Fred, who is Scrooge's nephew. He looks like he's loving life there. He's Scrooge's cheerful and generous nephew who never gives up on Scrooge, and he knows that he can change as long as he kind of keeps moving and has these epiphanies and kind of acts on them. Okay then, so that's kind of a very quick kind of rundown of the key characters in A Christmas Carol. But let's analyse them now in more depth. Now, this text could be argued by some people to be an allegory. And an allegory, or an allegorical figure, is where a character isn't just a character, they actually symbolise somebody or something in the real world. So there's more to them than meets the eye. And we call that the allegory. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at each character, just fairly swiftly. We'll look at the role of the character in the text, so what they actually do, but then tease apart the allegorical symbolism behind them and what they actually represent. So let's have a look then, and if we can do that in your essays, you will get higher marks. So first off then, let's look at Scrooge. Okay, so his role in the text, as you can see, he's the main protagonist, but he's a miser. He won't give you any money at the start, but he's transformed by supernatural intervention, and that makes him lead a better life. Fairly straightforward. But if we unpick the allegorical symbolism just on the right hand side there, he symbolises then within all of us the possibility for redemption. We can all lead better lives. And he also represents a critique of greed and selfishness. He almost is greed and selfishness, and he symbolises those kind of horrible values that Dickens is trying to critique. So there's more to it than meets the eye with all of these characters, and that's what he allegorically symbolises. It's one for you to definitely reflect on. Then we have Bob Cratchit. So Scrooge is underpaid clerk, as we know, and he's a kind and devoted family man. That's what he means literally. But what does he allegorically represent? Well, if we look at the right, he represents the hard-working poor in Victorian society, and dignity and kindness in poverty. He represents those positive values and the working class in Victorian Britain, who are working their socks off. They're not really getting that much in terms of their wealth, but they still retain their dignity. And that's what he symbolises. Then we have the Ghost of Christmas Past. So that's the spirit that shows Scrooge his earlier life in a spiritual kind of revelation. But what does he symbolise? Well, as you can see there on the right, he symbolises human memory, regret and lost innocence. We all have regret, it's a human emotion, and we all have a concept of memory. And that's what that ghost kind of really represents, and kind of gets us reflecting on our upbringing and how it might have affected us all as people. Then we have the Ghost of Christmas Present. So, as we know, he's the spirit that shows current Christmas scenes as a means of kind of triggering Scrooge's reappraisal of his life and actually get him to lead a better life. But he allegorically symbolises, on the right, generosity, abundance and social responsibility, looking after the weakest people in society, especially at Christian festival time like Christmas, where, you know, Christian teaches us that we need to look after the weak at those times especially. Then we have the Ghost of Christmas to Come. So a mysterious spirit, and he shows Scrooge's death as a means to trigger his interest in his legacy. You know, he needs to look after kind of not just when he's here on earth, but how people will remember him. So allegorically, on the right hand side, you can see there, he represents, for me, in my classes, I teach it as he represents death and the fear of death and our mortality as well. And the consequences of a life without change. If you don't change whilst you're still alive, then you're going to run out of road. You're not going to be able to change because you'll be dead, obviously. So he represents the kind of fear of our own mortality and death, and not being able to change life's choices anymore. Then Jacob Marley. So Scrooge's dead business partner, as we know, and he symbolises the burden of unrepented sin and guilt and moral reckoning. So because he didn't make the changes before he died, well, he died and then he was condemned in the afterlife. So he very much allegorically symbolises unrepented sin and the need to try and change things whilst we're still alive. Then, just as a bit of a bonus, almost, you get a couple of bonus allegorical figures, because we have characters of ignorance and want, and they are represented in the text as two starving, frightening kind of children revealed beneath the robe of the Ghost of Christmas Present. Now, they are almost allegorical figures in themselves, because they're called ignorance and want, but they represent those two things then in Victorian society. So ignorance, not wanting to know anything, and Scrooge is very ignorant at the start of the text, but also want, which is another way of saying poverty. Victorian society had a lot of poverty, and so those two characters are almost kind of bonus allegorical figures, helping us to understand some of the perils and the horrors of living in Victorian England, especially if you were poor. Okay, so if we come down here then, just zoom out for a second, we're going to now round off by looking at a character arc and how the key character of Scrooge kind of changes throughout the narrative. It'd be very good if Scrooge comes up in the exam, it'd be very useful. So first off then, let's look at what he's like at the start of the text. Now I think you probably have got an idea what he's like. So in stave 1 then, Scrooge is a miser, basically. So he's introduced as cold-hearted and obsessed with money. Okay, really, really unpleasant to know. So Dickens presents Scrooge at the start as the embodiment of Victorian greed, or the allegorical figure for Victorian greed, if I want the top grades, and selfishness at the start of the novella. And a really good quote, it's so memorable, which shows this characterisation at the start. He was as hard and sharp as flint and solitary as an oyster. That's such a great kind of quote. But it really symbolises that Scrooge is not a pleasant guy to know at the start of the text. However, it does change. Now, as I teach when I'm teaching my students around the world or in class, novels and novellas are normally about turning points, and this is a big turning point in the narrative for Scrooge. So in stave 2, the ghost of Christmas past kind of gives him guidance. So the ghost is kind of like a spirit and very firm but compassionate, and represents memory and regret, and kind of teaches Scrooge the errors of his ways, obviously. And a really good quote is, "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light that I give?" So he's basically saying to Scrooge, you need to listen. You need to take this on board, because if you don't, it's implied, from a Christian interpretation, you could end up in hell for being too greedy and not living a Christian life. And so it's a real turning point. It's an ethical turning point, and it turns Scrooge on the right path, I should say. Then at the end of the text then, how does Scrooge finish then? Well, let's have a little analysis of that. So by stave 5, you can see he's looking very jolly there. So Scrooge becomes joyful, generous and transformed ultimately. So he is now an allegorical figure of hope, proving people can change. They can redeem themselves. Redemption is what he symbolises. And a really good quote at the end. "I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year." Okay, so he's very much changed. He's no longer solitary as an oyster. He's a much more sociable and kind of Christian kind of guy. Really, enshrining those positive values. Okay, so by way of a summary, let's just see if we can tease out maybe 3 key takeaways from this lesson. So I would say, if I was you now, I would be learning all of the characters with the who's who and doing some independent research on those, making sure that you know all the characters, because we don't know which ones can come up in the exam, so you have to be ready for anything. Then I would maybe watch this part of the video back again about the allegorical figures, that table, because that's quite high level thinking. That all the characters are kind of symbols for something, and I think you really need to kind of reflect on each one there to make sure that that technical term gets into your essays and into the exam if you want the high grades. And then also reflecting on maybe Christian values, Victorian Christian values, and how Scrooge didn't have them at the start, but he does have them at the end, and what Dickens is trying to say about Christian values then within the text. I think that would be a really good thinking point for you as well. Okay, so it just remains to say, if you found this video useful, then please do hit the like, subscribe, tap the bell icon, tell all your friends, and do keep an eye on the Milton Rose Learning YouTube channel, because we drop quality content every week. So with that in mind, it just remains to say, obviously, keep growing, keep learning, and we'll see you soon.